Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Courtney Doggard. I'm the head of Network 2020. Welcome, everyone, to our conversation today about the world in crisis. We are just, hard to believe, 3 weeks into 2026, and already on the world stage, we have seen the removal of a leader of a sovereign country by US forces, the violent crushing of protests in Iran that were buoyed by social media statements from President Trump, and renewed threats to Greenland's territorial status, effectively threatening NATO. So, as Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney just said in a speech at Davos, we know the old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy. So, where are we? I am very pleased today to dig into this question with three notable experts who might not be able to provide all the answers, but can at least give us all a better framework from which to understand this monumental shift in geopolitics. So before I introduce our guests, just a few words about Network 2020. We are a New York City-based nonprofit, and we aim to bring nuanced and incisive conversations about global affairs to rising and established leaders, both virtually as well as in person in New York. So I encourage everyone to follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel or our Global Insights podcast, and that's where you can access our library of on-the-record discussions. And for those in the New York City area, I encourage you to join as a member. It's one of the best ways to support Network 2020 and gives you access to really incredibly unique in-person events. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. First, we have Professor Amitav Acharya. He is the UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance and Distinguished Professor at American University's School of International Service. He is the author of, among others, The Once and Future World Order: Why Global Civilization Will Survive the Decline of the West. Next, I am pleased to welcome Professor Dan Drezner. He is Academic Dean and Distinguished Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He is the author of 7 books and writes regularly on his Drezner's World Substack. And lastly, it is a pleasure to welcome Professor Stacie Goddard, the Betty Freihoff Johnson Professor of Political Science and Associate Provost for Wellesley and the World at Wellesley College, where she focuses on questions of great power competition and international order. Her latest book is When Might Makes Right: Rising Powers and the World Order. So welcome to the three of you. It really is a pleasure to have you here today with all that is going on. I hope we can make some sense of it. So Dan, I wanted to start with you. I think it's very easy for a lot of us to take for granted the fact that we grew up in this somewhat predictable international system, or maybe it just seems predictable in hindsight. And I think a lot of us are looking at this uncertain world, and we're trying to put a framework around this changing system. But I think it's important to start with a little bit of international relations theory, particularly for those who weren't steeped in it. What are we talking about when we talk about world order? And where do you rank this international liberal order that we've had since, the post-World War II world order on the scale from kind of zombie to, we're just tinkering around and doing some renovations here?
Well, first of all, as an international relations professor, we should always start every conversation with some introduction to international relations theory. I'm glad we've all acknowledged that. That's a good way to start. I think in terms of when we as international relations scholars talk about global order, it's often easy to think about, are you talking about like a world government? Are you talking about, a truly Hobbesian world of anarchy? And the answer is it can vary dramatically. When we talk about order, we are talking about the global rules of the game, not just the ones that are written and codified, but also the sort of unspoken ones, the sort of informal ones as well. And there have been times in global history where, in fact, it has been what we would consider a Hobbesian order, where really anything goes. It's a war of all against all. Life can be nasty, brutish, and short. The liberal international order that you're referring to is somewhat different, beginning in the end of World War II in the Western Bloc, and then after the end of the Cold War more globally, you really did see the codifying of a whole set of rules regarding, the territorial boundaries, regarding global security, regarding international economics, trade, finance, and so forth. Now, to be clear, the liberal international order was never entirely liberal. It was never entirely international. And the United States on occasion acted in a hypocritical fashion. So did every other great power, I would point out. The difference was that you could argue in the main, the United States as the most powerful actor in the system also binded itself to the rules of the system. The rules that it created in part served its own interests, but there were times where occasionally it didn't want to comply with those rules, and every once in a while it would violate them, but most of the time it recognized there was a long-term value in adhering to the rules of the game because it incentivized others to do so as well. Now, when you talk about what is the current state of the liberal international order, I have to admit I'm going to be extremely pessimistic here. Think of a real estate, since we have a president who's a real estate guy, the real estate term would be to say that at best, the property we are looking at, if you're talking about the liberal international order, has good bones, right? Like the general principles have some value to them, but there is so much that would need to go into, rehabbing. You need to do a gut rehab. The problem is that we've seen so many contradictions build up over the last 10 to 15 years. And that has been accelerated in the last year with Donald Trump. So Elizabeth Saunders and I wrote a piece that came out in Foreign Affairs on the website yesterday that basically points out Donald Trump is not the author of the sort of downfall of the liberal international order, but he has undeniably accelerated its demise. He's basically poured kerosene over everything and then lit a match. So could you see a somehow sort of revival of the liberal international order in a post-Trump world? It's possible, but the adage goes, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. This is the second go around with Trump, and this is the second go around with the United States electing someone who seems quite willing to disrupt the liberal international order. Regardless of what happens over the next 3 years, it will be very interesting to see how the rest of the world reacts, even if you have a new president who says the right things when it comes to the liberal international order.
Great. Thank you for that. Amitav, turning to you, you've written a lot that the world order is basically this iterative global process shaped by ideas and norms over a much longer period of time that goes beyond, let's say the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So from that longer term perspective, how do you interpret this current recalibration of the world order, and what are some of the scenarios that you're envisioning?
Thanks very much. Before I answer the question you just posed, I just want to say a word about what Dan just said about liberal order. I also agree that the liberal order is not coming back, and its death was predicted not by Marconi or highlighted, but has been, people have been saying that for at least 12 years, 15 years in 2009 world economic crisis. And now the West is just waking up to it. So I sent out a tweet this morning, X post this morning, just highlighting that fact. And but I also think it's not going to disappear completely. Remnants of that will remain, elements of that. But they have to coexist. It won't be a hegemonic order, the only game in town. It will have to coexist with spheres of influence, Chinese organized world order, and the like. So you'll have what I call a multiplex concept. That leads me to answering your question directly. Why not going to disappear completely? Elements like interdependence, economic interdependence or trade, openness of seas, humanitarian values, independence of states, sovereignty. These are not necessarily Westphalian creation. These are not necessarily American creation or European creation. So that's what my book argues. I did this book, 5,000 Years of History, basically to trace backward the origins of many of these concepts we call world order. Not just historically, but today. And I found that many of them emerged in multiple parts of the world in rudimentary foundational forms, admittedly imperfect, but that goes to independence of states, peace treaties, diplomacy, economic interdependence, and humanitarian values, just war principles, and also some bad things as well. But I'm not going to talk about the bad things, talk about the good things, because people think of the liberal order as something really good, which I don't agree, but let's say that. So why don't we recognize that? The reason we don't recognize this earlier foundations of world order that came from many what we call non-Western civilizations, Islam, China, India, Africa, pre-Columbian Americas, is because there's something what I call the Wright Brothers syndrome here. The Wright Brothers invented the aeroplane, but the aeroplane today is very different from what the Wright Brothers, the Wright Flyer, did. So similarly, the Athenians supposed to have invented democracy, but democracy today is so different from what happened in Athens. Because they didn't have really universal suffrage. They didn't have individual liberty. It was liberty of the polis rather than liberty of the individual. But we give them credit that Athens invented democracy. Greeks invented democracy. But we don't give similar credit to other civilizations who actually invented things in a very rudimentary form. Because the West basically thinks the most latest version of those ideas, like human rights or republicanism, as the ones that final time they emerge in the West. One final point here is that many of us who are political scientists would know Robert Dahl. Robert Dahl was a former late professor at Yale, one of the biggest scholars of democracy. He once said that to deny credit to the Wright brothers for having invented the aeroplane because the modern airplane is so different from what they did is like similar to not giving credit, to deny Greeks credit for inventing democracy, because democracy today is so different from what the Greeks practiced. So we apply the Wright brothers principle. We give credit to the Wright brothers for inventing the airplane. We do not give the same credit to the other civilizations, including not only just the big ones like China or India, but Africa and Latin America and the like. So there are layers of this prior inventions of world order that are related to the contemporary world order. And not just the historical world order. And that's basically the substance of my book and the answer to your question.
Fantastic. Thank you. So maybe there's a little bit of optimism that there's sort of this, human instinct to create alliances and have, some sort of order that goes beyond, just the Hobbesian alternative. So, Stacie, turning to you, together with Abraham Newman, you've developed this concept of neo-royalism. Could you briefly explain why you think, what that is and why you see that as a useful lens for understanding today's international order? And also maybe a little bit about how that differs from what I think a lot of people are talking about, which is spheres of influence.
Yeah, and thank you for organizing this, Courtney, and to Network 2020. So I think it helps, and I'll pick up a bit where Dan left off on the liberal international order. To understand neo-royalism, it helps to explain what it's not. So, as Dan noted, in a liberal international order, you're basically talking about a world of nation states and institutions. So some sense of global governance, a series of rules that help govern the interaction of states. The purpose of having these rules is to increase, ideally, wealth and prosperity among nations, right? Now, this is obviously, as all the other panelists know, has been in decline for however long, at least a decade. And to your point, Courtney, about what people expect or how people kind of approach this, was the general idea was what's going to arise to take this place was the Westphalian great power competition system, right? A number of great powers, and particularly the United States, Russia, and China, generally trying to increase their own power in order to protect their national security, right, and advance their influence at the expense of others, right? And this could also include, territorial spheres of influence where they would show some sort of domination, again, to kind of advance in the name of advancing national security. Where Abe and I started out with neo-royalism is we just saw a lot of stuff that sat rather uneasily with this world, right? So if you are in an age of enhancing national prosperity, why attack Venezuela? Like, what's the point for oil that nobody actually wants to refine? If you're trying to build a sphere of influence, why threaten Greenland? right? You already have a sphere of influence in Greenland. You have one very robust military base that you've had since the Cold War, and the right to build an infinite amount more, right? There's no need to expand into Greenland. You've already expanded into Greenland, and you have helpful allies there. So that's actually undercutting a sphere of influence. Add to this a real kind of gleeful willingness to punish your allies, you know, the people who are supposed to have your back in this game of great power competition. So what Abe and I think we're actually seeing is not Westphalian great power competition. It's something that we refer to neo-royalism, right? So this too, by the way, has a long lineage. We oftentimes tend to think of 17th century before Europe, but you can also think of the Mughal Empire. You can think of the Mongol Empire, right? Any sort of real kind of sovereign imperial formation. And the idea is that the actors in this order, they're not nation states. They're ultimately royal cliques. These are groups that are centered around somebody who sees themselves as an absolute sovereign. They can include members of the family. They can include, kind of providers of capital and support for that organization. They can include ideologues that lend legitimacy to the clique. Right. But this is really fundamentally the unit that we say Trump at least would like to see dominate. Right. And the purpose here and the process is all very different. Right. So the purpose here is not to enhance national security or enhance national wealth. It's to enhance clique security and symbolic status. Right. So even to be clear, at the expense of national security. Right. And obviously then too, the foreign policy processes aren't being done by a state. They're not being done by a bureaucracy. They're being done by this really, really small clique. And this is what we argue makes sense of this. Venezuela doesn't benefit the national interest, but it certainly does benefit this small clique. I mean, Trump has not at all been silent about this. You know, he's going to own the money and he's going to disperse it the way he sees fit, right? Similarly, we see what's going on in Greenland being much more about building up symbolic and material status for just a few, rather than actually enhancing any form of national security status. So that's the framework, and that's how the lens kind of sees the world a little bit differently than a Westphalian great power competition lens.
Great, thank you. I'd love to just jump off of that point where you have sort of this political and economic elite, and apologies if I'm, reducing your argument in a way that's ineffective, but where the business and economic, or the political and economic elite, are coming together for their own, coalescing around their own interests. So Dan, you've done a lot on economic statecraft, international political economy, using Stacie's framework, jumping off from that. How do you see the role that the economy is playing in shaping the world order? Do you agree with this assessment of neo-royalism, and what are some of the risks or opportunities of this alignment?
Sure, thanks. I also want to take this opportunity to say it's an honor to be on this panel with my two distinguished colleagues, both of whom have written things that I wish I had written, but was not smart enough to come up with. But to focus your answer on Stacie's their co-author piece on neo-royalism, I think I would say a couple things on this. The first is that one of the reasons this has been able to come about is, and this is a shift not just within the United States, but within a couple of other countries, but it's the US shift that's most pronounced, is that, and this predates Trump, is that we've seen a sort of shifting of foreign policy responsibilities from Congress and other institutions to the executive branch, and then within the executive branch, consolidated within the presidency. These have been slow motion trends that have occurred since the post-Watergate era onward. And so part of the reason Trump is able to do what he is doing is that, yes, he's willing to sort of ignore norms and in some case, frankly, ignore laws to do what he's pursuing with, let's say, creating a slush fund for Venezuelan oil or what have you. But it's also the case that Congress, frankly, is out of practice when it comes to acting as a constraint on any kind of foreign policy behavior. And indeed, Congress over the last century has sort of almost had a position of we actually should not be the ones setting tariffs. So after the wake of Smoot-Hawley, for example, 100 years ago, Congress decided we should delegate a lot of these powers to the president and so forth. So that's part of why, in some ways, that's kind of the permissive condition that you need to talk about for why this sort of neo-royalist order can potentially emerge. And I think as Stacie and Abe pointed out in their paper, it's not clear if it's going to consolidate. It's sort of one possible thing. I think the really interesting thing about in terms of economic statecraft, there's two things that are legitimately intriguing, I guess, from an analytical perspective. From an American perspective, I'm not thrilled about it, but from an analytical perspective, it's interesting. The first is the degree to which, the United States has decided, hey, we have a lot of advantages when it comes to things like weaponized interdependence. Global capital markets run through the United States. There are various areas, even in tech, where there are key U.S. components that are absolutely vital to global supply chains. We have an extremely large market. We can use these things to try to coerce other actors. And you've seen this from the Liberation Day tariffs onward, with, frankly, a mixed track record of success. It turns out that the U.S. is able to, by and large, coerce its allies pretty effectively. They're not going to get huge things in return for that, but they're going to get some concessions. And then when it comes to countries like China, the U.S. backed down like a scared puppy. It was clear the Trump administration was legitimately surprised by the Chinese response to the tariffs, and in the end, not only wound up cutting a deal, but cutting a deal that in many ways was more favorable to China than what, let's say, the Biden administration had done in the previous year. Think about the deal with NVIDIA chips would be the best example of this. So the question of the sort of long-term effects of this, in other words, to what extent will allies and partners of the United States still consider the United States an ally or a partner if this persists? And I think there's valid reasons to wonder about that. I think the second sort of analytical question, and I don't have a great answer to this, but it's an interesting question, is to build on the neo-royalist story, is whether or not this theory of interdependence will work. In other words, is there a royalist peace? So international relations scholars like to think about a commercial peace, right? The idea that if two countries are significantly and economically intertwined, it raises the cost to both of them if they were going to choose to go to war. So this is, liberal theories of international politics talk about all this all the time. Immanuel Kant talked about this. More recent scholars refer to it as the commercial peace. That's not what neo-royalism is, though. It's not about broad-based economic interdependence. It is literally about an elite network being intertwined. And it is possible that that elite network being intertwined could actually cause states that otherwise might be inclined to go to war to decide, you know what, it's not worth it. I'm really rich. Why do I want to risk those networks? But it is also possible that either it's not that effective a constraint, or instead of a sort of royalist peace, what you actually have is a royalist extractive cartel. And so as a result, they might not fight each other all that much, but they will be tempted to conduct lots of operations on the periphery, and in this case, the periphery includes Greenland, to try to extract as many resources as possible in order to enrich themselves. And I don't think we know how that's going to play out yet.
I'm feeling like I need to start playing Settlers of Catan again or something like that. Oh, great. Thank you for that. Amitav, Dan brought up China. A lot of public debate frames China as either trying to overthrow the international system or simply free riding on it. You've suggested, I think, a more complicated picture. It's very hard to have a conversation about international affairs and not talk about China. So how do you see China and, perhaps even the BRICS more broadly operating within international institutions, within regional organizations today? And what do you think that suggests about where the global order might be headed?
Well, part of the answer is obvious. China is not the one that's overthrowing or trying to overthrow the liberal order. The United States is. We could say that China had an agenda maybe a few years ago, but right now, before our eyes, is Trump that is trying to overthrow the liberal order, has maybe already done that. In that case, thinking of China, there is China and the BRICS. We kind of have extremes here. It goes from being fear of China as a threat, to, in some ways, hyping not only China, but the BRICS that are supposed to be challenging the US-dominated world order. I think the truth is in between. I think China wants to keep some elements of the current order, liberal order, including the trading system. China is not trying to overthrow the WTO. China is not withdrawing from multilateral institutions. And in many cases, it's trying to, of course, manipulate them and get its people into those organizations, but it's not always succeeding. So in that sense, the role of China in institutional terms has to be seen, or even in terms of economic interdependence. China is the largest trading partner of the vast majority of countries in the world, and they must be getting something out of it. It's not just exploitation, which may be still there, but is still there, but it's not just that. It's not sort of the royalist, neo-royalist way of seeking resources, very different. So in that sense, I would say try to find a sort of middle ground between the fear of China and embracing China in the way it's like a few years ago, or maybe 2 decades ago. So without bringing China into WTO will solve the problem. China will become socialized into the current international system. Just a very quick point about the Royalists, because both Dan and Stacie have talked about it, and I support that idea that it's something that you want to bring into the mix. I don't think there will be any particular framing of the world order, whether it's multipolar or a royalist, or it's a polycentric or bipolar. My argument is that it's a multiplex. It's all different elements will stay, remain as part of the overall mix. So it's messy, it's complex, but on royalism, let me just tell you that royalism goes back to Sumer and Egypt. So I'm thinking of history here. And it is actually the first Eastern export to the West. So in fact, Aristotle himself thought royalism was better than democracy. A good monarchy is better than a pure democracy. That's Aristotle. He particularly praised the great king of Persia, the Persian monarchy. Despite all the animosity between Greeks and the Persians. And when Alexander conquered Persia, he actually anointed himself, not Alexander was the student of Aristotle. He did not create a democracy. He called himself the great king of Persia and the pharaoh of Egypt. So there are some good royalist sort of traditions which we should take into account, not the current tradition, of course, is negative, but history can tell us a little bit about the key point is that it's going to be a complex, messy picture. It's not bipolarity, multipolarity, liberal hegemony. It's going to be a mix of different types of orders. And whatever it is, the BRICS and the Chinese are going to play a very important part of it. So we should just accept it rather than fear it.
Great, thank you. And I'll just get in one more question before turning to the Q&A box. So if you're listening and you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And I see a lot coming in there already. So Stacie, last question for you. You've touched on some of the recent foreign policy moves by Washington. I'd love for you to just expand on that a little bit in this context of a neo-royalist world order, and more looking ahead, what kinds of developments would confirm or challenge your theory?
I would say, and I think this draws off a lot of what my colleagues are saying as well. This is a really unsettled moment. So I'm not even sure if I'm comfortable saying confirm or deny, because it's this when Abe and I are talking about it, it's one element that's out there, right? And we in some ways believe it's always been out there. Right? There have always been people who have been interested, leaders interested in this, right? Orban was interested in far before Trump was. Erdogan was interested in far before Trump was. This is a particularly important moment, both because of the decline of liberal international institutions and because an actor that is so powerful, the United States under Trump, is the one that is actually kind of making the case and following this impulse into the order. But ultimately, if in a few years, it sounds like Abe and I were invested way too much in our fantasy novels, great. Like I'll be totally happy with this outcome. I would love to be proved wrong. And certainly there are a lot of instances right now that do challenge the theory of this being an order, right? Amitav brought up the idea that China is consistently participating in institutions, right? So there are plenty of other elements out there. I think our concern right now is that the more actors and leaders kind of take this as a mere aberration, right? This too shall pass. Let's just wait a few years and then we'll go back to normal. the more all of this gets embedded, right? And what are the types of things that'll get embedded? Let me just go through a couple of instances, as you said, kind of unpacking US foreign policy, right? Do we really end up with a board of peace? Right? Not only, the United States kind of ignoring the United Nations Security Council and the United Nations system, but setting up a parallel institution, right? Allowing people to kind of buy their way onto that institution, getting that type of legitimacy. Argument is like you let that type of stuff become established, it becomes normalized, it becomes part of the structure. And those are the types of things that can then be sustained after Trump and beyond US foreign policy. It becomes really embedded in the order itself, right? Going back to Dan was giving these fantastic descriptions of actors, who are benefiting economically from this, right? NVIDIA basically being able to access China again, deep financial ties between United States technology companies on the one hand and the Gulf states on the other. Those don't just go away once Trump goes away, right? So today we can look at particular instances and say, okay, Trump's foreign policy here confirms this, right? It's foreign policy by the few, for the few, and deeply extractive, right? But I think then the question is, what's the evidence that it becomes part of a system, right? And maybe it's not the only order, but it is one of the dominant orders. And I think we're looking to see how deeply all of these material and symbolic institutions, how deeply they become embedded in the international order.
Thank you. Okay, so the picture I'm getting is we're getting, it might just be a slight, or not slight, but a recalibration of a lot of different systems that have already existed, but we're kind of playing up some of them more at this moment, and it is going to be quite messy, I think, is the operative word.
And just to draw the domestic analogy, I hope that all of us are learning that institutions are only as strong as the practices that undergird them, right? So to that extent, we can port that kind of same insight into international relations. The practices, how people are actually doing international relations, that's what's going to make the system run.
Thank you. Turning now to the Q&A box, I'm getting a couple of questions that ask about the role of the United States as a rogue actor and what might constrain the United States in that sense. And as an addendum to that, someone also wants to know how that affects your careers as geopolitical analysts. But Amitav, I'd like to just start with you, and Dan or Stacie, if you'd like to jump in, please do. If the US is seen as a rogue state, what constrains it, or what might emerge to constrain it?
I would say yes. I was recently at a meeting of the World Affairs Council National Convention. The question became whether the US is loved or feared. The Trump's policies to make America great again and its assertive foreign policy is actually creating more respect for the US or fear. And I said it's creating more fear than respect. And that was like 2 months ago. And I think the United States not only seen a rogue state. I have, in my latest article in Foreign Policy, I call it the indispensable rogue. It used to be that Madeleine Albright, called the former Secretary of State, said U.S. is the indispensable nation. We cannot do cooperation without the United States. That will remain the case. U.S. can be the biggest spoiler if it doesn't get involved. And there would be probably a regime change in Washington, either a moderate Republican, if there are such things, or a Democratic president who will try to bring U.S. back into multilateral institutions and restart cooperation. It's not really, you can have 300 executive orders in the first few days to reverse many, not all of the Trump's policies. Some damage will be long-term. But even if that is done, the trust U.S. will never regain the trust of the international community, including its allies. And that's what I said in the foreign policy article. So it will be seen that American participation is good, but it is kind of roguish. It cannot be trusted. So you have to be very wary of that. And that's one reason why the old liberal order ain't coming back.
Thank you. And we have a question here from Professor Simon Reich at Rutgers. And so he poses this to both Dan and Stacie. So Dan, maybe I'll start with you. So he writes, following Amitav's broad analysis, to what extent is your formulation American-centric to the extent that you are framing things through the American example? If I'm sitting, for example, in a BRIC member state, does the global order look very different with informal multilateral or minilateral institutions being built from the bottom up? Trump, Putin, and less so Xi may conform to the strongman image. But he's saying, but the rest of the world, including the EU, and I think that this is an important point, are busy rerouting globalization and building alternative structures.
So are you asking this to
this is for Dan.
Okay.
Dan first, and then anyone else can jump in.
So yeah, the questioner raises an extremely valid point, which is to say that while the United States has made it clear that it doesn't necessarily respect the WTO anymore or is withdrawing from a whole bevy of international treaties and organizations, this hasn't stopped other countries from trying to, maintain that kind of trade integration. You've seen the EU reach out and launch a variety of trade deals. You've seen, as a response to the United States, or really Trump spurning Modi in India, Modi suddenly re-embracing the possibility of the BRICS. That iconic photo in Beijing of him with Putin and Xi. There is no doubt that other countries are trying to go about and, preserve the good bones that they like, or, build a little guest house of their own that they might like, that doesn't necessarily include the United States. I will say that the reason we're focusing on the United States, and this remains true, is that I do think there's been a situation since 2008 to underestimate the degree to which the U.S. has underwritten the sort of rules of the game that existed in the liberal international order. And the degree to which, if you have, for lack of a way of putting it, regime change within the hegemon, what does that mean for the overall order? Now, it is true, I want to be very clear about this. The United States is not an all-powerful hegemon. The U.S. is not nearly as powerful now as it was, let's say, even 15 years ago. And, particularly if you look at manufacturing, China is going to be the undisputed hegemon and is increasing its relative share of manufacturing power going forward. But there are a lot of other pillars of economic power, and particularly if you look at things like capital, the United States still matters significantly. So the idea that if the U.S. does something, the BRICS can just sort of ignore it, it actually reminds me of talk back in the fall of 2008 when you had the BRICS saying, well, it doesn't matter if the United States experiences a financial crisis. We're decoupled from it all. And it turned out that that was not true. And I would also add, building on what Stacie said in terms of sort of the neo-royalist networks, I guarantee you that where people have their money parked, if there is a crisis that affects the United States or that leads to a rout of U.S. treasuries, that is not just going to affect the U.S.
And just kind of add on that, I don't think we are talking about Trump in the United States, as Dan said, for really good reasons. But we don't want to underplay either alternative visions or possible resistance, right? So, for example, Amitav has been talking about the importance of Xi, and Xi and is very much a strong man and is a consolidated power. But interesting enough, is consolidated power in China around the idea of anti-corruption. Right. So even that doesn't sit particularly well with this neo-royalist vision. So I think that's really a real potential part of pushback. And then I think the question is, and is the scale to which the resistance to this, how large can the resistance get, right? I don't think kind of mini deals are enough. I do think the EU and Mercosur that's a good start, right? That's the type of scale of free trade deal like one needs to be able to push back against this model.
Great, thank you. And I'll stick with you, Stacie. We have a question here for you. Where they write, the neo-royalist theory appears to lead to greater chances of collusion between the global players, but how could they end up competing against each other, and could that lead to greater instability?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it opens up a lot of collusion of the type we've been talking about, the ideas of cartels, the ideas of, royalty and courts. That can be arguably kind of a fairly cooperative world, but there's so much potential tension built into the system, right? Nobody would say the dynasties of past were somehow peaceful. But I think the question is not so much whether or not there's conflict. It's not a question of a binary of war and peace. It's the question of the dimensions of conflict. What are actually the flashpoints here, right? And when I think of a neo-royalist order, two immediately stand out. One is questions of succession, right? Who actually gets to lead this order forward? Presuming that Trump or and Putin and Xi and whomever don't actually live forever, although I'm reminded of Putin and Xi's overheard conversation about the potential of living forever, but I'll set that one aside. Assuming that, what kind of battles are we likely to see internally and externally over who actually gets to lead this movement forward? And the other one are battles over recognition. Right. And part of what we're saying is that this isn't just about dominant, like financial dominance. It's not just about economic extraction. It's status extraction, right? It's symbolic recognition. And again, to kind of juxtapose this to great power competition, we've already brought this up. Look what happens to Modi in India, right? When he refuses to recognize Trump's claim that Trump brought peace to India and Pakistan, right? Immediate kind of imposition of tariffs. This is a country that the United States has been kind of trying to woo into US orbit for at least a decade because of China. And this battle over status recognition instead led to conflict, right? Now, this is a bit of a one-off, but then the question becomes, can you imagine broader battles that could happen over failures to recognize spheres of influence, over failures to recognize demands to extract resources, over failures to recognize who's the dominant actor in the system?
Great, thank you. And for you, Dan, you mentioned the gradual decline of congressional power in foreign policy. How could that branch take back its power or potentially increase its role?
There's a quick answer and there's a longer term answer. The short term answer is because, we are so polarized in terms of political parties, you would need Democrats to win in the midterms in terms of taking control of the House. The Senate is going to be a much more uphill climb, but it is actually conceivable that that could happen as well. If you have opposition control of Congress, you are suddenly going to see, a lot more sort of, activity, if nothing else, holding hearings, subpoenaing, executive branch officials and so forth, trying to do that. On the other hand, we also saw this play out after the 2018 midterms. It didn't lead to a lot, although it did lead to an impeachment or two. The deeper answer is that you are going to need a broad bipartisan. There's only two ways this happens. Either the first is that Trump fails so miserably, or there is such a backlash to him that there is not just a blue wave, but a blue tsunami, where you suddenly have Democrats really dominating Congress in a way that they haven't, since 2009. And then they decide, okay, we need to rewrite the rules to make sure that this, doesn't happen again. Or you have Republicans who, if there is a sufficient, and again, this does get connected to the midterms a little bit, if there is a significant blowout by Democrats in this year, you have to remember Trump is a lame duck. He can't run for election again, even though he's going to toy with it, or even though he's going to talk about it. And this leads to the succession stuff that Stacie was talking about. But if you start seeing Republicans realize, okay, or at least enough Republicans realize, okay, just as post-Watergate, we need to actually rein in the powers of the presidency. And they will have political incentives to do that if they recognize that the next president is likely to be a Democrat. And that could lead to the passage of laws, or just, for lack of a way of putting it, Congress remembering its muscle memory of, oh yeah, we used to hold oversight hearings. We used to actually investigate what was going on in terms of the executive branch. A lot of this is just institutional memory that has passed away, in no small part because, not that many members of Congress right now were members before Trump was ever president. And so we talk about, for those of us who are old enough to remember what life was like pre-Trump, there's often a conversation about how this is not normal, or this is normal to a lot of people. And then the question becomes, can you have Congress decide, what, we need to either create a new normal or revert back to where things were, circa the 1970s.
Right. Thank you. Amitav, I'm getting a couple of questions about climate change in here. And so I'm curious to kind of bring them together into one. We're so busy talking about the crisis at the moment that we're not talking about some of these larger global crises like climate change. How do you see this multiplex order coming together to address challenges like climate change?
Well, the first point to keep in mind is that climate change has always been controversial, especially in the United States. But it's has a lot more support in Europe and also some parts of the global south. I mean, China and India, of course, are large polluters, but they're kind of in between in the sense that they do want to address climate change, but they want to get support from the West. There is a term called common but differentiated responsibility. It's a common challenge, but we need help. We need financing. And this is what the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol were about. And Trump has basically withdrew the United States from them, including the Framework Convention. And so now the leadership passes on to Europe. I mean, one of the points I make in this idea of the multiplex world, which includes elements of different types of orders, but I think leadership in a future world order will be issue specific. No single country is going to lead in every area. The United States is still the greatest power in the world. If you combine all the indices of power, military, economic, greatest military power, there's no way China is going to challenge that for any time soon. The Chinese are already the manufacturing superpower, as Dan said, and also infrastructure superpower. So they will lead in economic development. The European Union plays a very important role in the rules for AI governance technology to climate change. And the leadership will have to pass to the EU, that they will take it up, and I think they will. There's a lot of domestic support for that. So the world minus one idea that I put forward means that we will have leadership in areas that the United States has abandoned, being picked up by other countries, based on capacity and competence, and the European Union will be part of it. Chinese will be part of it. India can play a role in things like vaccines and maybe from software development to parts of AI development. The regional countries, regional powers like Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, they will play their role. So I think there is a lot of differences on climate change among different segments of the global south, but I think there is much more consensus there. And you had very successful climate meetings recently with the US boycotted. And I think this will go on. I don't think, but this is a long-term issue. It's not, doesn't sort of affect people in one day or 1 year. So that's why, because it unfolds, it's not like a pandemic, breaks out and everybody gets concerned. So because climate change is slow moving, that cooperation also takes time to build. But I generally think that climate change cooperation will continue. The municipalities, the states, American states like California is going to push for climate change mitigation. So it's not just the federal government of the US. Cities and states will also support it, as they have been doing. So I am relatively optimistic, but I don't think it'll be resolved in 1 day or in 1 year or 10 years.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, a good reminder that the multiplex world also includes subnational diplomacy in there as well. Stacie, we have a question here. Does the global order now get reduced to deals and payments? And have there been instances of this in the past?
Not at all. And as a matter of fact, this is why I think sometimes Abe and I push back against the idea that, well, and this was always the case. So here come the crony capitalism. I think that there are a few reasons why it's not just simply kind of deals and exchanges. The first of which, again, I really want to highlight what we see is the important non-material aspect of this, the recognition, the deference, the domination, right? That we were talking earlier about the kind of, and this came up, Amitav, like the kind of more idealistic human yearning for progress and for rules. I think it's worthwhile to remember the not so idealistic human yearnings for power and status and recognition, right? As being, unfortunately, some of our baser instincts, right? So with that in mind, you realize that like deals and exchanges, there's something else that's really non-material. And the second thing that I would say, and this would be kind of looking ahead to a more settled moment, every single order has to have with it a purpose and a legitimation, right? A way in which we understand why this is the way things should be, which isn't to say that it is actually the right way for things to be, the just way things would be, but it's the thing we understand, right? And so, the examples I would be, there was a reason that a Mongol Khanate was considered to be, and the concept followed, could claim legitimacy. And oftentimes that was based around, what the use of force and successful use of force symbolized, right? If we go to things, that were extremely developed, there's a whole, obviously, role of a papacy and the Catholic Church in kind of symbiotically legitimating the dynast and the dynast legitimating that religion, right? So that goes beyond a transactionalism into the realm of legitimacy and institutions. And again, I'm not saying that we're there yet. As a matter of fact, I think this is one of the most unsettled parts of the order is what does this all mean and why is this legitimate? But I expect to see some, movement and attempts to make sense of it and to narrate that. I think we already are, to be clear, but.
Dan, we have a question here. Easy one. What is the future for democracies in this new era when the United States, its greatest example, is sliding under authoritarianism in a world that is increasingly dominated by strong men and insecurity?
So glad Dan got this one.
So I think there are two ways to answer this. The first is there's a colleague of ours named Siva Gunitsky who wrote a great book about what happens when the hegemon when there's a power shift and the hegemon is of a different regime type. So in other words, what happens if suddenly like a democracy surges to become the most powerful actor in the world? Or what happens if a fascist or a communist or an authoritarian state suddenly dramatically becomes the most powerful in the world? And Gunitsky didn't talk about what would happen if there was a regime change within the most powerful country in the world. And that's what makes this so unusual, this current moment, because you've got, Polity and others claiming the U.S. is no longer a consolidated democracy. If you really believe that the U.S. is now a sort of quasi-authoritarian state, and I don't want to, I'll hedge on whether that's actually true or not in a second. But if you accept that, then yeah, the implications are pretty wide-ranging. And you've already seen that within the Trump administration. The Trump administration has evinced zero concern for human rights or democracy promotion, unless it's a state that it already doesn't like. It's ostensibly done this for Venezuela, for example, but the hypocrisy on this is just sort of massive. And so it has withdrawn USAID funding. It's made it clear that it really does not care about these things, which therefore makes it easier. And furthermore, the U.S. has shown an eagerness to cut deals with, various local warlords is an unfair term, but in some ways, like local leaders. So the fact that when the U.S. extracted Maduro, that Trump has demonstrated a real preference for dealing with Delcy Rodriguez rather than with Nobel Prize winner Maria Machado is sort of a giant red flag that actually the administration doesn't care about regime change, and in fact will be perfectly comfortable with the status quo. The 64 Bitcoin question, I don't know how to put it, is this the future for the United States? And I think we still don't know that answer. This is where, there is no denying that if you look at things going on in the United States right now in terms of the Trump administration, in terms of, aggrandizement of executive power, the dispatch of National Guard troops into various American cities, what's going on in Minneapolis right now, it is very easy to say, well, the U.S. is no longer really a consolidated democracy. But even those who have sort of made this statement in terms of among political scientists have also acknowledged that the courts still matter. Congress still matters. Part of the reason that the administration has been able to do what it's wanted to is that since Republicans control majorities in both houses of Congress, they have been extremely reluctant to step up. I think the midterms are going to be a very strong signal of to what extent is the U.S. really moving away from what we would consider an electoral democracy or not. If the midterms play out as most people predict, and Democrats at least gain one of the chambers, then the next question is what happens after that? How does the administration respond? To what extent do they try to thwart it? I guess my point is that if it's easy to say things have changed and they can't be reversed, but I also am old enough to remember when people were having this conversation 8 years ago and saying the same thing. So we will have to, and I know this is a dodge, but we'll have to wait and see on this.
Amitav, question here. You mentioned the growing role of BRICS states in the future order. Each member can have different priorities and agendas. So what common approach could they agree to?
Well, the BRICS have always been a very divergent group, different political systems, different levels of development. But I think the key problem for BRICS has been that the two biggest members in terms of economic heft or military heft, India and China, are not the best of friends, they're enemies. So developing a common position for BRICS when India and China are continuously hostile to each other and often boiling down to, after turning into hot war, and that hasn't disappeared, despite the fact that Trump has got Modi to move closer to China. In a way, it hasn't been. India was kind of considered part of the Quad and strategic partner of the US, but Modi feels very insulted, and Indians generally feel that they have been shortchanged by Trump. So India had to, just like Canada went to China as well. America's new enemies basically are turning to China. And in that case, that might strengthen BRICS. And BRICS has also expanded now to 10 or 11 members. That's both a strength and a weakness, because it creates more divergence within BRICS. Several of the new members, like Ethiopia and Egypt, are also significant territorial conflict. And if the Saudis actually join BRICS, they can bring in a lot of resources. But I think we should not be putting all our hopes on the BRICS. I think it's a broader issue that with a coalition of emerging powers, some of them may be BRICS, some of them regional powers. Indonesia has joined BRICS. That's a very good thing for Asia and Southeast Asia. So it will make a difference, but it's not going to replace the other types of arrangements and orders we're going to have because of the divisions within the BRICS, especially between China and India.
Great, thank you. We have just a few minutes left, so I'll just close with a kind of a rapid fire question for each of you. And I'm going to close with Mark Carney again, just because that was the Davos speech I watched. I haven't watched Trump's yet. And he said, we are in the middle of a rupture, not a transition. So, from each of you, starting, Amitav, Dan, Stacie, is this a rupture? Is it a transition? Is it something else entirely?
So if I go first, I'm a little amused by all this talk coming out of Carney, and I respect him. I'm actually both a Canadian and an American citizen, so things fall apart in the US, I might go take a refuge.
Damn it, you have options, Amitav.
But I think the general thing is that this has been happening for quite some time, and the Davos men that Huntington put it, where were they all this time? Why couldn't they see this coming? I mean, many academics have pointed this out. Of course, these academics don't get invited to Davos. So what he said is very important, but I think about 10 years too late. But we should take it seriously. I think it's a transformation. It's not. I mean, if it is a rupture, it's a very significant rupture. There is no going back, except that some elements will survive, and countries like Canada have an important role. Canada going to China, signing deals is what I call wall -1. Cooperation will continue without the United States. European Union, India negotiating a free trade. European Union signed a big trade deal with Mercosur in Latin America. So those things will be happening. And I think we should, the key point is that let's not bemoan what's gone. Let's just live with it and make the best of it and look for new possibilities. And that's basically what I've been arguing since 2014, and including in the new book.
Dan, rupture, transition, something else?
I believe it was Farewell to Arms in Hemingway. One character asked another, how did you go bankrupt? And he said 2 ways, slowly and then suddenly. And so to build on what Amitav said, yeah, there have been long-term sort of trends that have suggested that the order was already on its sort of last legs. But like any Jenga tower, you can take off the pillars and the structure will remain standing right up until the moment that it doesn't. And so what we're seeing is the sort of last, now we're in the sort of cascade moment where it does seem to be falling apart. So there are both underlying and proximate causes, but yeah, it's a rupture.
Stacie, final word?
I mean, agree with everything they've said about the fact that this is a long time coming. I guess what I would say is rupture, transition, how about a moment of order making and contestation? And the argument here should be take it seriously. Even the parts that don't seem serious, take it seriously because the people are going to need to throw their power behind the order that they want to see.
On that note, thank you all. This has been incredibly helpful, I think, in this very, for us at least, unparalleled time, and not certainly within world history if we take a longer view. I really appreciate your taking the time, sharing your insights. Just a quick note, our next briefing that is free and open to all, we have rescheduled our one on Venezuela. We're very excited to have Chris Sabatini back with us. That's next Wednesday from 12 to 1, so that's free and open to everyone. For those in New York, we will be talking about the Space Force and space power. That's in person February 24th, so please join as a member if you'd like to attend that. And again, we are a nonprofit. We rely on the support of individuals to keep this going, so very much appreciate anything you can do to contribute. And with that, Amitav, Dan, Stacie, thank you so much. It was such an honor to talk with you today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.